afternoon and welcome. My name is Maureen McCarthy, and I'm the current president of City Club. Our mission is to inform, connect, and engage our community to strengthen the civic health of our region. We emphasize civil conversations and listening to others. We're also committed to bringing light, not heat, to important issues. On May 26th, we are delighted to welcome Rick Steves back to Bellingham City Club. Rick Steves is a travel writer, activist, and host for 21 years of Rick Steves Europe on public television. He'll be joining us for a conversation regarding the future of travel. We hope to see you there. As always, I'd like to thank all of the volunteers who make our programs possible. I'd also like to thank KMRE Radio's board member, Robert Clark, who's producing today's program, as well as BTV10, who will be broadcasting it and sharing it with their viewers. On that note, if you know of people who had to miss today's program, please refer them to our website at bellinghamcityclub.org. They can find it there next week. I'd like to take a moment to thank our business sponsors for their support. They are Larson Gross, Lummi Commercial Company, Danny Neal of the Moyot Group, the Opportunity Council, Pacific Continental Realty, Unity Care Northwest, Village Books, Whatcom Community College, Whatcom Community Foundation, and Western Washington University. And finally, I'd like to turn things over to Christine Perkins, who will introduce our speakers and moderate today's program.
Great, thank you very much, Maureen. Good afternoon. Homelessness has, for a number of years, been listed as the single most important problem in Bellingham. In caring and compassionate Bellingham, homelessness is ever present and on our minds and in our hearts. We see our unhoused neighbors in tents and on our urban trails, but we also know that many of these individuals are couch surfing, living in cars and RVs, attending our schools, living in motels, residing in emergency shelters, and being served or waiting to be served by the impressive array of services that Bellingham offers for individuals struggling to keep a roof over their heads. Bellingham is not alone. Homelessness trends in Bellingham mirror national trends, showing growth that outstrips the capacity to provide service. Communities across the country are searching for solutions and approaches to address the needs of unhoused residents, including the needs of homeless people who have the additional challenges of disability or behavioral health issues, who may be referred to as the chronically homeless. It is this group of our unhoused neighbors, the chronically homeless, who may require long-term services known as permanent supportive housing for them to be able to leave the streets behind. Along with the many other services and programs for the homeless that Bellingham operates, the city, in cooperation with local public agencies or nonprofit agencies, provides permanent supportive housing for a portion of the city's neediest residents. Today, in an effort to broaden our understanding of the services that can be especially effective in helping the chronically homeless, we are examining the underpinnings of permanent supportive housing. While much of this discussion will be familiar to our local housing experts, it's our goal to enhance community awareness of the complexities of the programs needed to address these issues. We are lucky to have with us today two experts with decades of experience in communities across the country that are working to reduce chronic homelessness. Todd Lipka is president and CEO of Step Up, a nonprofit organization providing permanent supportive housing that is based in Santa Monica, California. Philip Mangano is the president and CEO of the American Roundtable to Abolish Homelessness. Todd and Philip will share their international, federal, state, and local experiences addressing issues related to chronic homelessness. They'll discuss best practices and strategies that have been successful in engaging communities to work together to end chronic homelessness, as well as provide perspectives on the national conversation about homelessness. Please join me in welcoming Todd Lipka and Philip Mangano to Bellingham City Club.
I'm speaking to you from Los Angeles, which we might call the capital of homelessness in the country. At last count in Los Angeles County, there were over 60,000 homeless individuals on the streets of the county on any given night. So it's an issue we're certainly aware of. I'm going to kick off things very briefly and then introduce Philip, but I want to tell you a little bit about my organization. We've been around since the early 80s, focused on individuals with serious mental illness, and we are completely focused on providing people housing. And because we realize that you've been on the street for years, recovery is not possible without having a home. So everything we do is around this permanent supportive housing concept. And we do that in ways whether we build our own housing. So in California, in other states, we have dedicated buildings which have just all the individuals from the street, 100% chronically homeless individuals living in these buildings. That's permanent housing. We do what's called scattered site, is we find local units with landlords and move people in and provide support services from the street into housing and post-housing. We serve probably over close to 4,000 individuals right now, and we're a national organization in California, Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, and soon to be other states. That's a little bit of background about Step Up. But first I want to introduce somebody to kick this off, and you're quite fortunate because Philip is probably the national expert on these issues of homelessness and chronic homelessness and what the solutions are. He headed the White House Interagency Council on Homelessness under President Bush, President Obama, and the Interagency Council is literally the federal agency that sets homeless policy across the country. And during his tenure with President Bush and President Obama, he really brought forth the policies that we assume are normal today. Something called Housing First, permanent supportive housing. These were the policies that he brought in to the federal government, and everyone uses today as a recognized solution. As a result of his work in DC and setting the national agenda relative to policies and practices, I would say literally millions of homeless people who are formerly homeless, who never would have gotten the things that they need, permanent supportive housing, moved into housing over the years as a result, and millions of homeless individuals' lives were saved as a result of that life-saving solution of housing plus services. So he's going to kick us off. You're very lucky to hear some of his perspectives on homelessness and permanent supportive housing. I'll give this over to Philip.
Yes, that does look like the Golden Gate Bridge, and Todd did indicate that we were in Los Angeles, but I think it's indicative to see that bridge behind us, which, as you know, starts there in San Francisco, which is another one of the cities in our country that has had a difficult go at homelessness. In many ways, we're fortunate that our current governor, Gavin Newsom, was the mayor of San Francisco for 2 terms and made a priority of homelessness and actually did a very good job of reducing homelessness in that city. Places in the Mission area of the city and other neighborhoods were literally cleared of homeless people by virtue of the plan that he did and the strategies that were implemented. I was very fortunate to be in Washington at that time. He visited me when he was a supervisor, and then subsequently when he was a lieutenant governor. And just recently, in fact, just yesterday, we did an event with him out in San Bernardino, which called attention to a statewide strategy that he's implemented called Home Key, which actually puts into effect the provision of permanent supportive housing, the very thing that Christine alluded to in terms of being a key aspect of the solution of homelessness. He implemented a strategy called, as I said, Home Key, and that now has created over 6,600 units of housing all across our state for people who are homeless and on the streets or languishing in shelters. He has another investment of resources in his upcoming budget. So in many ways, we're fortunate to have governor who had the experience as mayor, who was in a city bigger than yours, of course, but wrestled with the very issues that cities all across our country wrestle with. So I'm really happy to be with you there in Bellingham. And I'd have to say, Maureen, I was really happy to hear that your next speaker is Rick Steves. Of course, I have, like so many people, have enjoyed his travel programs for years. I never go to Italy without his book and meet people that know of him or know him personally. But the reason I'm happy about that is that Rick himself has over the years been very concerned about the issue of homelessness and has made investments out of his company and out of his personal well-being. And several times I've talked to him when I was in Washington about the strategies that we were implementing across the country. So he's a person not only who knows how to travel and make the travel experience better, but he's worked hard to make the lives of homeless people and their travels better in the Washington area. Christine is exactly right. You're not alone in this issue. Whether you're a community of 70,000, I think you're slightly over 100,000, all the way up to the city that we're sitting in, Los Angeles, which is about 4.5 million. We're in the middle, actually, LA County. It's the largest jurisdiction in our country with over 12 million people in it. And it's also, unfortunately, as Todd indicated, ground zero on homelessness in our country. More homeless people in Los Angeles than any other place, including New York or San Francisco. So part of the work that Step Up does rightly in LA is to provide housing and support services for homeless people in the format of housing first and permanent supportive housing. But any of us who have worked in LA, and I visited LA quite a bit when I was in Washington, because it was very obvious. If you don't solve homelessness in Los Angeles, you haven't, and your intent is to solve it across the country, you leave about maybe a fifth of the homeless people in the country unresolved. So one needs to be considering Los Angeles. So as a result of that, Los Angeles becomes a place where many, many options, many ideas are tried, and only the best ideas, frankly, for the most part, survive. It's a competitive idea environment. So you're very fortunate to have Todd in the work that Step Up has done over the years. Step Up, which started as simply a traditional mental health agency, came to realize under Todd's tenure of the last 15 years that many of the folk that it was intending to serve, they weren't in housing, they weren't in the institutions, they were literally out on the streets or in the shelters throughout Los Angeles. And under Todd's direction, they shifted their emphasis and made a priority of not only engaging those people on the street, but also bringing housing to them. And when they began doing housing, of course, that was unusual back then for a mental health agency. In fact, mental health entities all across our country, state and county, often would say that homelessness, that's a mental health issue, not a housing issue. So why would we be engaged in housing? Of course, what we came to understand, both in my home state of Massachusetts and here in Southern California, is that the most therapeutic intervention in the lives of people who are homeless and mentally ill, that therapeutic intervention was a place to live, the stability and security of a locked door that allowed recovery to begin to happen. It created some normalcy and peacefulness in those lives. So the efforts that have been made by Step Up, which are now being replicated literally all across our country. Step Up is not only all over the southeast here in California, but it's also out to Florida and Georgia and in a number of other states. So Todd has a broad experience of providing permanent supportive housing, and again, often within the context of housing first, which is kind of the evolved way of providing housing for homeless people. But I would say there are no silver bullets, so neither Todd nor I are going to present you with something. You write it down, do it, and homelessness will be resolved in Bellingham. What we're hopeful of doing is providing some principles and some examples of direct practice that would be very helpful in your community. Some things undoubtedly you've already thought about, some things you've thought about and haven't been implemented, other things perhaps are new to you. Maybe the most important overlay to put on this is the idea of humility. We need to be humble in front of the issue of homelessness. For years, and I began working on a bread line in my home city of Boston in 1980, so that's 41 years ago. And we were quite confident on that bread line. It was outside the doors of a Franciscan church. We volunteers were quite certain that if we simply rolled up our sleeves, that our compassion, that our good intentions, our humanitarian gestures would quickly resolve the lives of the homeless people who were lining up to receive sandwiches and coffee from us. Well, unfortunately, quite to the contrary, as the years went on back then, when the technologies weren't as forward as they are now, there was no such thing as housing first. Permanent supportive housing was just being considered initially as an idea. In fact, the highest technologies we had were a church basement shelter, a bread line, and a food pantry. That was the height of technology. And what we recognized on that bread line was that the numbers continued to increase. So we rolled up our sleeves further, quite convinced that our compassion, our sense of concern, just as Christine was just talking about the compassion that's been generated there in Bellingham, we were convinced that if we rolled up our sleeves sufficiently, that in fact, we would resolve homelessness. That never came to be. And one of the things that we learned, and it's a hard lesson for any community, is that good intentions, well-meaning programs, and humanitarian gestures do not correlate with the ending of homelessness. In fact, they don't even correlate with the reduction of homelessness. Nowhere in the world, and I've been, when I was in Washington, I traveled all over the world looking for the best ideas. Nowhere did simply good intentions, well-meaning programs, and humanitarian gestures correlate with the reduction. And if our intentionality is not simply to manage homelessness, it's to bring it to an end, then we need to be focused on what are the elements. So we need to keep a good grip on humanitarian gestures and all of that, a very good grip on it. That often comes out of a spiritual or ideological or a political or sociological concern that we have. But if it doesn't correlate with the numbers going down, then we need to adopt new practices, new approaches. And the new approach that we brought to Washington was being focused on business principles and practices and applying them to homelessness. We engaged people like Malcolm Gladwell, writer of The Tipping Point, Jim Collins, Good to Great, Clay Christensen, The Innovator's Dilemma, to really harvest from their writings. And we had them involved in the creation of strategy at the national level. All three of them gave their work on a pro bono basis to help us develop the strategies that would take place. And what we learned from them was that you needed to concentrate resources on the most vulnerable population, just as Christine was saying, that those people experiencing chronic homelessness, those people who are languishing on our sidewalks, living in our shelters. That concentration of resources rather than dissipating resources. We learned from Jim Collins that we needed to go from good to great on this issue. Good was not good enough because it wasn't leading to ending homelessness. And what Jim Collins taught us, and what a theme of that book of his, Good to Great, is that the good that we think we can build on to get to greatness, actually the good is more often the enemy of greatness, because the good keeps us from implementing innovative ideas. The good is more focused on the status quo than it is going on a journey to get to greatness. And then Clay Christensen, who taught at the Harvard Business School, in his book, The Innovator's Dilemma, he made certain that we understood that you needed to be talking to the customer, not to the sales force, not to the provider agencies, but to the actual customer, to homeless people themselves, to determine what they wanted and what they felt they needed. And as soon as you do that, you come to recognize that homeless people, they never ask for a pill, a program, or a protocol. They ask for a place to live. So our responsibility to our consumer, to the homeless people that we were endeavoring to serve, our responsibility became to provide them with a place to live. And we soon recognized the difficulty of that and the fact that the critical issue for us as years went on and we got more sophisticated in providing housing, we came to the point where we recognized that we knew what to do and we knew how to do it. And the issue that remains for us is scaling that housing to be commensurate with the size of the problem. That's true in just about every community in our country. We need to be scaling the response, especially to chronic homelessness. And the means to scaling that response is varied. So, for example, in California, the governor has taken advantage of hotels and motels, which aren't at the occupancy level that they once were as a result of the pandemic. They're being available for sale, and the idea of purchasing them and converting them into housing, as I mentioned, 6,600 units in the last 6 months, with probably another 10,000 in the next year. That's a scaling activity so that you're actually staying ahead of the number of homeless people who are coming to the front door. For years and years, for decades, we were bailing the leaking boat of homelessness. We moved some people out and celebrated that, but in fact, more people came in the front door than we moved out the back door. So that those scaling initiatives are absolutely critical. Whether you're in Bellingham or in Los Angeles, that's the critical element. In the creation of housing actually is the central antidote to homelessness. So I'm going to invite Todd now to talk about some of the endeavors that Step Up has made, whether it's a hotel conversion very near the classic Hollywood and Vine in Hollywood, or some of the work that's being done out in Riverside and San Bernardino in California, are out in some other destination spots similar to Bellingham, obviously Santa Monica and Hollywood destination places. There are some strategies that have been implemented by Step Up. And so that's kind of the more practical aspect of what we're attempting to do. So I invite Todd to come back, and we're going to shift right now.
Thank you, Philip. So let me just give a little context here. When we talk about permanent supportive housing, we're talking about housing, which is a home, you have a lease, and you have support services. And those support services are not ones you should need to go travel outside to, to go to a mental health agency to see a psychiatrist. I can tell you the mental health system is difficult enough to navigate if you don't have serious mental health issues. And if you do have serious mental health issues, getting in those four walls can be very challenging. So the services should be brought into the community to where the individual is living. So that permanent supportive housing, the housing part, let me just make a simplification. When we look at the homeless population, let's divide it between the chronic, which is individuals a year or more of homelessness. It could be 5 years, 10 years, 30 years, even 40 years. And non-chronic, which is a year or less. But generally speaking, when you look at the chronic population, they are going to need this long-term support of permanent supportive housing. And it's a simplification, but the non-chronic, those who haven't been on the street for a long time, they don't need long-term support and services. They need an intervention that helps them get back on their feet for whatever led them into a state of homelessness, whether it was a health issue, a job loss. They'll need, a 6 to 9 or 12-month intervention and support to help them reestablish a independent trajectory. But the chronic population, they have complex needs of substance abuse, mental health issues, physical health issues, and maybe all of the above. So they're going to need housing support from a rent perspective and services coming into the home. Because they're, by virtue of their disability, whether it's a mental disability or physical disability, they're going to be very low income, so they can't afford the rent themselves. So that can come in the form of a voucher, like a Section 8 voucher, which is a subsidy from the federal government for low-income individuals. So what you want to do with permanent supportive housing with the chronic population is combine the limited supply of vouchers, make sure those go to the people who need them the most disabled on the street, the people who've been there the longest. And then combine that with the support services needed. And those support services can be literally physical health. So our teams have a nurse, they have substance abuse staff, they have a mental health clinician that go out and engage people so that we can provide whatever help and support is needed to the person on the street. Once we identify someone as chronic, who's in great need, our team goes out. It may take a day to develop a relationship. It may take 2 months, but we do whatever it takes to engage them, develop their trust, and say, we want to help you. What are your goals? And the nurse can address any physical health issues. The whole team is going to work with that individual and go back day after day to engage them, to build their trust, say, we really want to help you. And in almost all cases, what that person really wants, if you ask them, is housing. But we'll pair that team with vouchers so that we can say, okay, well, we're going to help you get housing. We'll help you search for an apartment in the area that you want. And once we help you get that apartment, we're going to come see you if needed every day until you start to feel more comfortable. So I often say, the individuals have been on the street, and we've housed people 30 and 40 years of homelessness. And I have to tell you that we look at retention. Does an individual stay in housing? We look at a year after we've housed them, the percentage of people that are still in housing. And for those people, 5, 10, 20, 30 years of homelessness, 97% of those who get housing and support succeed. They're still in housing a year later. So it should blow up this idea that people don't want housing. That comes from the fact that when you live on the street for years, you develop a very hardened exterior as an adaptation to the cruel and miserable world of homelessness. And the well-meaning intentions of individuals who come see you and say, can I help, and never show up the next day. Well-intentioned nonprofits who say they want to help and they never show up the next day. You develop a hard exterior as a way to protect yourself. But the fact of the matter is, if even someone's been on the street for a really long time, if you can truly offer them what they want, they will take it. So this idea of combining the voucher, and you don't really provide services unless there's housing attached to it, because I know some mental health agencies that they do outreach on the street to chronically homeless individuals. They do therapy on the street, and then they leave and they go home, and the person goes back and crawls into the bushes where they're going to sleep. That is perpetuating homelessness. So providing these two resources, housing and support services, in the street, engaging people, following them into their home, and continuing to provide the support. The team is going to have to work with the individual once they move into housing to unlearn their homeless survival skills and learn the whole new set of skills that you and I take for granted of cleaning an apartment, going shopping, cooking for yourself, cleaning yourself, bathing, budgeting, all those things you don't have to do when you're living on the street that all of a sudden become very critical success in living in an independent apartment, and unlearning the skills that you learned on the street to survive. We had one man who used to scream at the top of his lungs at 2:30 in the morning, because that's the way he stayed safe on the street. He yelled, people stay away from you. But that's not very functional in a house environment, to be yelling at 2:30 in the morning to your neighbors. So we helped him understand, really, the way you stay safe is you lock the door. You don't need to yell. So that's part of the adaptation of moving from a homeless environment and surviving on the street, life of misery, to being a part of the community. And this works time and time again, even with the people you think are hopeless. The problem is that there aren't that many resources for everyone on the street, whether it's Bellingham or Los Angeles. So what you have to do is prioritize those individuals who are most in need, the most difficult on the street, causing the most problems with police interactions, with the courts, going to the ER for their health care, costing the city, the PD, and others the greatest nuisance to the business, and engage those individuals. And focus those finite resources on those individuals who are highest need and highest problem to the community. So But what you can know is that this works, and you need to find housing wherever it is, finding vouchers. If you do have, as Phil talked about, the motel conversions, any housing that's dedicated for homeless individuals, affordable housing developers, when they do low-income housing, they don't want to have homeless people in their buildings, but they can be persuaded through advocacy to accept and to do a set aside for homeless individuals because they're all low income. To find that housing wherever it is, wherever you can find it through the housing authority with vouchers and dedicating vouchers to homeless individuals, and then getting the agencies to pair those services in a community-based program with those vouchers to ensure that the individual who gets the voucher gets support on the street and gets help to find a unit. And then once they're in a unit, gets ongoing support to help them adapt. Because I can tell you what happens is within a year or so, these individuals become transparent. They're no longer formerly homeless. They're simply residents of the local community. You would never know that they may have been on the street for 10 or 20 or 30 years because they look just like you and me. I'm going to turn back to Philip for some other final closing comments.
Thanks, Todd. Thanks so much for that description. Just very briefly, simply the implementation of a strategy like permanent supportive housing or housing first, that alone in and of itself has never correlated either with the reduction or the ending of homelessness in a community. In fact, there's a recent study that just came out, I think in the last month, that talked about housing first being implemented in a number of communities, but the numbers of homeless people actually went up. These strategies, whether it's assertive community treatment teams or housing first or other strategies that are best practices, that are evidence-based practices, they need to be within the context of a community-wide plan that is focused on performance and outcomes, the utilization of business principles and practices, just as you would apply those business principles and practices to your own business, to your other aspects of what government is responsible for. Outside of a strategy that looks at the entire context of the issue and all of the different strategies that can be brought to bear, individual strategies on homelessness have not worked ideally. So I would just caution that simply implementing one idea will not get you, if your intent is to reduce and end homelessness in your community, which I trust it is. I'm an abolitionist. I'm hoping that it is. You need to understand that there needs to be a community-wide strategy. In some communities, and what the best practice is it's led by what I would call the jurisdictional CEOs, the mayor, the county exec, whoever has responsibility for the resources of the community, that entity, mayor, county exec, owns the plan and ensures that the entire city or county is oriented to all of the aspects of that plan that do need to be implemented. In some communities where there hasn't been that kind of political will, then it's the business community that stepped up. So even here in Los Angeles, years ago, when I first came here, there was difficulty in terms of the political situation between the city and the county. As a result of that, the business community stepped up and began creating a plan. In fact, north of you, up in Canada, in Calgary, it was the same situation. The mayor wasn't interested in homelessness, thought it was a scary, a mysterious issue that could never be dealt with, that was an intractable part of the social landscape. In fact, it was the business community there that stepped up as well. They understood the creation of a plan shaped around business principles and practices oriented to performance and outcomes. That was needed. They implemented it, and we saw numbers going down there. So I would just caution, there's no one single silver bullet that solves homelessness. But we certainly know when you add a business mindset and business principles and practices to the equation, that gets you a lot further. In fact, in the United States, only when cities and counties began doing 10-year plans did we see a number of communities reduce the number of people who are homeless in the community. So that's simply a cautionary note, a theme that really needs to be applied to the larger strategy unfolding in any community in our country. And with that, I think we'll turn it back to Christine. I know that the intent is to have some Q&A right now.
Let me add in a few things here to what Philip was saying, which is what can you do as a Bellingham City Club? You know, I can tell you there's so many voices going on, and there, you know, with the sweeps going on in your community and other things happening, there's a lot of controversy. There's a lot of different people going every which way, police, providers, civic organizations. And I would encourage you to not interject yourself in all that riffraff of different conversations going on, but simply to act as an advocate, understand what is going on. Where are the resources for housing, and who are they going to? Who has them? And then I can tell you, my colleagues in the provider organizations, generally speaking, they often think about what they provide, the services they provide, and they just want to keep providing those services, whether it actually leads to the right outcome of ending someone's homelessness. There are many homeless service providers who really don't want to have anything to do with housing. Think about that for a second. Their sole business is to work with people who are homeless, and they're actually not providing the single thing that will end that person's homeless situation of housing. So to think about it, not so much about all the things going on, but to focus on the things that we know that work. So where are those permanent supportive housing resources in your community? What are they? How many resources are there? How many housing vouchers? I can tell you, I don't know if you're guided by a city housing authority or a county housing authority, but that is the main source of housing resources that comes from HUD, the federal government, down to the local level. And those resources are like gold because they enable a low-income, chronically homeless individual to get and pay the rent. And if you don't know how the voucher works, let's establish a rent. Let's say a studio apartment in Bellingham is $900 a month. So this low-income individual who maybe has disability income of $1,000 a month, they obviously can't afford an apartment because that would leave them with only $100 a month for a living. The voucher says, okay, this individual will pay a third of their income towards rent. For them is $300. The voucher will provide the difference of that, the gap between the 300 and the 900. So the landlord will get a payment of $600 from the housing authority for the voucher and a payment of $300 from the tenant. So these things are like gold. And of course, there's a limited supply of housing vouchers. And oftentimes housing authorities don't want to serve homeless individuals. So part of your role could be inquiring, okay, what are the housing resources that are here in our community and who are they going to? And I think similarly, to ask that question on the service resources. What service resources are available to chronically homeless individuals? And are those going to the most needed? And are those being paired with the individuals who need those resources? And are they going together with the housing voucher? Because most cities, even ones of your size and definitely of Los Angeles, there's so much going on and there's nobody really aligning all these resources to work together. They're often going in directions that are inconsistent with a common goal. I know it's amazing it's amazing to say that. It must be amazing to hear it, that when you have a problem that's as difficult and intractable as homelessness in any community, and the finite resources that are available are not really aligning to reach a common goal. That's actually one of the main problems in most communities, is no one is guiding the plan to say, this is what we're trying to achieve. We want to house 200 individuals in this next year, and we're going to align all single resources, housing vouchers, supportive services, and get everyone who's working on this move in that same direction aligned with this goal. That doesn't happen in communities. That's one of the things that Philip brought from Washington as a template for communities, is to develop a plan, a specific plan, a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan to achieve very quantifiable outcomes. I can tell you the homeless service system would rather not have to deal with quantifiable outcomes. So a civic group, a business group, a group like yourself can start to inquire about these things and hold somebody accountable to say, what are we trying to achieve here? Because I can tell you the system as it is designed for confusion and almost anarchy, with things not working together and not aligning together. And it sometimes takes some outside group that has no vested interest in any of the resources to say, what are we doing? And why aren't we doing something that's more thoughtful and more logical to get to a specific solution? And then to hold someone accountable for, did we reach that solution or not? And if not, why? It's sort of that rationale that doesn't exist in most communities.
Well, super. Todd and Philip, thank you so much for giving us a lot to digest and think about here on this important issue. I'm seeing some questions starting to come into the Q&A, so I encourage people to go ahead and use that feature. We'll be getting to the questions as we can, and I'm going to start by prioritizing questions that are related specifically to serving the chronically homeless and aspects of permanent supportive housing, since our experts here have a lot of experience in this area. I'll start with a very quick one just to help ground us. What percentage of the homeless are chronically homeless?
If we're talking about the entire population of homeless people, you're talking about both individuals and families. The chronic population is generally constituted primarily by homeless individuals, and the percentage of people experiencing chronic homelessness, according to the data and the research, particularly that research of Dr. Dennis Culhane at the University of Pennsylvania, tells us that somewhere between 10 and 15% of the population of homeless individuals experience chronic homelessness. That is, they've been homeless for a year or more and have a disability by virtue of mental health, addiction, HIV/AIDS, physical. So it has to be both a year or more plus a disability. 10 to 15% of the individual population. The number of families who are experiencing chronic homelessness is a much lower percentage within the context of family homelessness.
So I'll just add to that. When you think about that, it's a relatively small percentage of the homeless population, but they consume a disproportionate share of the resources towards going to homeless people. You know, they have more interactions with the police, more interactions with the jails, more interaction with the courts, more interactions with the ER, more interactions with 911 calls. So it's a smaller percentage, but it's a much higher utilization and a much more visible population.
Now, both of you have mentioned the housing first concept, and that is one that the city of Bellingham also subscribes to. But I'm wondering, from your perspective, what the definition of housing first is. How does drug and alcohol use play into that definition? And are there ever requirements to seek treatment under the housing first model, or is that not compatible with the technical definition of housing first?
So housing first is really, it's mislabeled a little bit because it's not necessarily housing first. It's a consumer-driven system to help somebody attain their own goal. You know, if you have kids and you want them to do something, the worst thing sometimes is to say, do it. You want to really work from their perspective. So the housing first really says, we're here to support you to achieve your goals to the individual. Let us help you achieve those goals. And the vast majority of individuals want housing first, because that's the foundation for recovery. So that's why it's called housing first. But it changes the paradigm. The existing paradigm was, here's the service system. And individuals who are homeless revolve around the service system, whether it's food banks or shelters or housing or mental health. And hopefully the homeless individual can at various times intersect with the service system and get help. Housing first really says, no, this is the homeless individuals. They're at the center of the system. And we're going to revolve all the resources around that individual and provide those where the individual is, not expect the individual to come to where we are. because that becomes a huge barrier. And so it's called a harm reduction model, that we provide things to support you around you, and we don't require that you do things that create harm and trauma as a condition for support. You know, if you know some shelters, there are many private shelters, homeless shelters, that require someone to be clean and sober before they can sleep there. Well, guess what? You know, that serves a certain person, but it doesn't serve typically the chronically homeless, because they don't want to meet those preconditions. So the individual never goes there for the help that's needed. And so the system is rejecting the person. So the Housing First system says, let's reduce all those barriers to someone getting the help that they need. So we won't require you to do drugs, to be part of the system. Because we know drugs are what we call self-medication. They're a way of dealing with the misery of homelessness. We won't require someone not to do drugs once they move into housing, because if you live in an apartment building or you live in a house, pretty sure your neighbors are using drugs, some of them. They're not required as a condition of housing not to be using drugs in their own home. So we don't require that. But what we do know is when you give people the help that they need, that, and we've seen it in our housing, that the utilization of drugs as people stabilize and over the years goes down and down and down. And, you know, you can start to say to people, you know, why are you doing drugs? Well, you know, maybe they're hearing voices in their head. You say, well, we have a psychiatrist, and actually they can help you find some medications that will quell the voices without the side effects of doing street-related drugs. So it's about that stabilization process. And quite frankly, it works.
This is related. For permanent supportive housing to work, do the individuals who need the housing need to acknowledge and understand their own mental illness or disability? Our questioner has the impression that some folks who find themselves on the streets don't acknowledge their disabilities. Is that an issue or a barrier to the success of permanent supportive housing?
You know, probably the thing that would drive someone away about as quick as anything else who's been chronically homeless on the street, you go up to them and say, do you have a mental illness? And in fact, we developed a system. There's you know, in order to get help, the federal government requires that every community have an assessment system. And one of the most common assessment systems used in the country is called a SPDAT. And it's a certain assessment tool. And it's a self-reporting tool. So someone self-reports if they have a mental illness. And if they report a mental illness, a physical illness, substance abuse, they get certain points. And the higher the score, the more likely it is you're going to get the limited resources that are available. And since it's a self-reporting system, people have mental illness, that's the last thing they want to acknowledge is I am mentally ill. Think about that, the stigma attached to that. So the individuals who need it the most, the people who are really seriously mentally ill, they say, oh no, I don't have a mental illness. The people who are not mentally ill, they know if they say they have a mental illness, they're going to get a higher score. So they self-report, so they game the system. So that very assessment tool used to help the people who are most disabled actually has had the opposite effect sometimes, because people with mental illness don't want to self-report you have a mental illness. Heck, you know, with the stigma attached to that, why would anybody want to report that they have a mental illness unless they know they're in an entirely safe environment with a system that's going to be responsive to their needs and provide them with the help that they need without stigmatizing them? Because for me, when I think about it, a couple of years ago, I was touring one of the writers for the editorial board for the LA Times, and we were in one of our Santa Monica buildings. This is on 5th and Colorado. It's about 2 blocks from the famous Santa Monica Pier. The building, it's a 32-unit apartment building, all for chronically homeless people. It has views of the ocean from the balconies. And the editorial writer said, you know, Todd, some people say, I'm middle class, I can't afford to live in Santa Monica, let alone with ocean views. Why should a homeless individual get to live in such a community, in such a location? And I said, well, think about it. They've been homeless in Santa Monica for years. And when their mental illness started, whenever that was years ago, we failed them as a system to get them the help that they needed. And as a result, their lives went in a downward trajectory into a state of homelessness, into a state of misery for years and years. And now we say to them, oh, you're the problem. You don't want our help. So now we not only failed them, but we blame them. So these are the individuals that are most deserving. We failed them and then we stigmatized them. They're the most deserving of these resources, this help. And after years and years of being stigmatized, why would they ever admit that they have a mental illness? Because all it's done is penalize them.
What data do you have about the prevalence of mental illness with homeless individuals? Are there any statistics?
If you look at the chronic population, it's somewhere between 25 to 33% of those in the chronic that have serious mental illness. One of the things that we've done as an organization is we broaden the lens to say we're not simply focused on serious and persistent mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar, depression, schizoaffective, but to say if you're chronically homeless, you're struggling with serious mental health issues. It may not be a full-blown illness or a diagnosable illness, but you've lived through years of trauma. And we know that probably whatever led to your homelessness was traumatic experiences. So when we look at the chronically homeless population, if we say not simply a serious mental illness, but are struggling with serious mental health issues, I would say 100%, because living on the street, it's very traumatic. You know, you're worried about your safety, you're worried about how you're gonna live from day to day. 100% of your energy is consumed with just surviving. So in the chronic population, you can virtually assume everyone. And what we do see is what Sam Sambiris, the creator of Housing First, is complex issues. You know, they have mental health issues, they're probably going to have physical health issues, and they're probably going to have substance abuse issues, or at least two of those. So we do see that very commonly. And you have to address all those issues together.
So that brings me to the balance between housing first and behaviors that might put others at risk. So does housing first mean anyone can do anything in their housing, even if it harms others?
Oh no, oh no. No, these are tenants and they're neighbors, and they're expected to abide by the conditions of their lease. They're expected to be a good neighbor and not do anything illegal. We try and balance that with that these individuals have been criminalized for their lifestyle issues for many years. But we don't want to, as they're going through the adjustment process, sort of penalize them for any infraction, because that's what their history has been. We want to provide a supportive environment, but we don't tolerate ever physical violence. I mean, we partner with the police on that if there's any case of that, we address it, and we address it legally. But you know, you'd be surprised to learn that that's hardly ever the case, that people really want housing. And when they do get housing, the vast majority of individuals recognize this is gold. This is an invaluable resource and what they always wanted. I was standing on the street with 3 of our new tenants yesterday when Philip brought in Governor Newsom for this Home Key project. It was a 76-unit motel we converted. And 3 of the tenants were saying, oh my God, this is what I dreamed of. I never thought I would be able to get this after living on the street for years. That's more the reaction, not people who are physically violent. In fact, research shows that for those with a serious mental illness who get the support that they need, they're no more likely to be violent than the general population.
If I could just chime in on that as well. I think part of your question, Christine, is somewhat predicated on the nomenclature, housing first. For a long time, people in Congress opposed housing first because they thought, you're placing people in housing and you're just leaving them there, and they're just to do whatever they can or whatever they want to do. And we know from the past the failed policy of deinstitutionalization, closing down the back wards of mental hospitals, placing people in the community without the support services. That was a disaster. They thought it was a repeat of the disaster. But the hard reality is what housing first comes to mean, what it's evolved to mean, is that people are placed in housing by agencies like Step Up and other agencies around the country. Then they're provided with customized services. So the services are actually evolved to be attuned to the exact needs of the customer who's in the housing. So you're actually getting a better investment of resources because they're attuned and specific to the person who's placed. And as a result of that tuning to the customer, you actually have, as Todd said, a retention rate of 96% on some of the most vulnerable and disabled people who are out on the streets and languishing in shelters. So it quite the opposite of the nomenclature of housing first. It's housing with lots of customized services to support the tenants.
And so when we house someone, if it's a difficult transition, my team would sometimes maybe go in 2, 3, or 4 times a day through the first period of time, because, think about it, when you lived on the street for years, you don't know what to do, and it's very confusing. In fact, many chronically homeless individuals, it's not uncommon to find it takes a year before they actually start sleeping in their bed as opposed to the floor, because the floor is what they're used to when they were homeless. So there's a whole set of adjustments that go on, and the team has to be ready and willing and able to help with whatever those needs are. Once someone starts sleeping in their bed, well, maybe you need to go shopping with them to show them what it's like. Where do you buy stuff? Maybe you then you cook a meal together and instruct them on how do you cook a meal, And when we move people in, we don't move them into a bare apartment. We make sure that it's all fully furnished with furniture, with pans and dishes and flatware, and towels, sheets. Can you think of anything more depressing than moving into an apartment that has no bed, no sheets, no towels, no nothing? So it's really about being responsive to that individual and providing whatever they need to succeed.
You've mentioned a 97% success rate, for meaning people are still in permanent supportive housing after that first year. What is your definition of success for both the individual and for your program that you're putting forth?
Well, first of all, the industry standard is retention rates, because if someone has succeeded for a year in housing, the year is the most difficult transition period. So if they succeeded for that year, kids are very likely they're going to stay in housing. And it's just really designed because they're disabled. They can stay in that unit for the rest of their lives. So that's what we want. Our success is not really what you might think, which is that, okay, person recovers, they get a job, they get a full-time job, they're able to give up the voucher, move into a community apartment, and sustain that entirely for themselves. But I remind you again, this person has a disability. So we judge it based on a very individual basis, because it's based on what are the goals of that individual. And maybe in that first year, it's to retain housing, it's to sleep through the night, it's to get medication, to do things to quell voices in their head, whatever that is. But we also know that as time goes on, maybe that person wants to do some volunteer work, or they want to feel maybe get a part-time job, or get some job training, or take a class. So those are things we're going to help support the person to engage in, access those resources. And what we're really trying to achieve for everybody is that sense of belonging and that sense of community. So if you think about it, you wake up, you're next to your family, your roommate, your spouse, your kids. You feel connected to them. In a non-pandemic time, you go to your office or you're on Zoom with your business. You're interacting with your fellow colleagues. You feel connected. You go to the Bellingham City Club for a meeting. You're connected to all the other members of the club. All those spheres of community make you feel more rooted and a part of something, and that you belong to something. That's really what we're trying to achieve with these individuals over time. To give up their homeless network and develop new networks. And the more networks you have that you feel connected to, the more you feel grounded in the community, the more successful you be, and the happier you be.
And just to add to that, one of the ways of thinking about what Todd was just talking about, the idea of securing social capital, individual capital, And we know that there have been some great books, starting with Bowling Alone by the Harvard Kennedy School Professor Putnam. The whole idea of acquiring social capital so that you have relationships with family, friends, faith communities, and other organizations that provide a basic safety net for you. Should anything go awry, you can turn to family or friends. What is common in the lives of almost all homeless people is they've completely moved beyond a social net for a variety of different reasons. They don't have social capital in that. They've depleted the social capital. They've burned out friends, neighbors. They've moved away from where they live. So a lot of the work of homelessness, which we don't talk enough about, is replacing the social capital in the lives of homeless people. And simply having homeless people hang out with other homeless people, it's not really the restoration of social capital that allows them to move beyond homelessness and get out of homelessness. So part of the work that Todd is talking about in programs is that restoration of social capital. And I would also suggest that there's a particular approach then for places like Bellingham, which is a place where people come and become homeless, a destination city where people become homeless. And what we're seeing in a lot of the destination cities around the country, especially, for example, Santa Monica in California, is that they have very strong, what they call reunification programs. That is, when someone comes in from someplace else, rather than allowing that person to spiral down into homelessness, the longer they spiral, the longer it takes to get them out of homelessness. They're engaging them as quickly as possible and attempting to restore them to the social capital that they might have left. In Santa Monica, they may have no family, no friends, no social connections, no faith community, none of those things. But back home where they came from, they do have those. And so the idea is to reconnect them to the deepest place of social capital, because that's the best restoration vehicle. That's a vehicle that keeps people out of homelessness. Generally, people who have a depth of social capital don't fall all the way into homelessness. They may have problems in their life, but they don't go to the street and to the shelters. So the idea, the sociological idea of social capital is an important one in terms of viewing homelessness, and any community can begin progress on that in terms of developing a reunification strategy.
Okay, so your interventions that you offer for the people in permanent supportive housing sound really intense and require lots of different individuals and organizations to interact with the people in the housing. How is that funded, and is it possible in a community the size of Bellingham, with the number of people that, or the number of people that would require services? It sounds costly, is what I'm getting at.
Well, I'll just start that one off. Todd can speak to it as well. One of the things that we haven't talked about are the economics of homelessness. And when you do a plan, a strategy, one of the things that you would look at are the economic consequences. An aspect of that is exactly what you just talked about, Christine. How expensive is the housing? How expensive the services? How do we get there? How do we climb that hill? What we tend to forget is that this population of chronically homeless people who are suffering from disability and on our streets, in our parks, in encampments, they are very costly to the public purse. In fact, numerous studies have shown they are the most costly individuals in any community because they randomly ricochet into very expensive health and law enforcement systems. So when they need primary health care, sometimes it's an ambulance, but it's always the emergency room of the hospital. The average cost of an emergency room visit in our country is $1,000. An ambulance ride is $350 to $400, and that's before any medications or inpatient or pharmaceuticals. They're also taking resources in terms of police interventions, court costs, incarceration costs, And of course, when they're going into the behavioral health system, mental health and substance use, they're always approaching those systems through the acute door, which is the most expensive way to go into those systems. And in cost studies and then subsequent cost benefit analysis that's been done literally all across our country, and then we encourage places in Canada and Australia to do it as well. In every single community, the cost of a person randomly ricocheting through those expensive systems was more expensive than the cost of providing them with housing and the support services that they needed. So this population is already very costly to the community. You only need to visit the emergency room of your hospital and talk to emergency room doctors and nurses who see the same people over and over and over again. So it's costly economically, but in my travels, I've also discovered that it's costly in morale. Those doctors and nurses and police and firefighters who engage in 9/11 responses and judges and jailers, their morale is decreased by seeing the same people over and over again. So all of the cost studies indicate that moving toward a system that provides the housing and the support services, that's the appropriate way to go, not just for compassionate and for heartfelt reasons, but economically, it's the smart thing to do. And Malcolm Gladwell wrote a brilliant article on this in the New Yorker a number of years ago called $1 Million Murray. I would recommend that as reading in terms of how costly it is for a person to be randomly ricocheting across systems as opposed to literally housing them. So it's costly not to get the job done for people.
And when we talk about concrete costs, so our organization spends on the service side for these individuals somewhere between $8,000 to $12,000 a year to support them in this system. That's not including the housing voucher. So it's actually not that expensive. And I can tell you that there are many funding resources for the service side coming in. We have a team approach, but my staff are called service coordinators because part of their role is to engage in a one-to-one with the individual, but also to coordinate all the outside services. So to bring in existing outside services and help the individual to access that. 8 to 12,000, it's actually 8 to 15,000, I take it back, depending upon the severity of the individual initially. I can tell you there are many service resources out there, but they're going to whoever gets the resource based on the criteria by the service organization. And that's why it's really important to identify the inventory of resources of services and say, are they going to the most needy? And are they being aligned together rather than everyone works in their own siloed area? Because sometimes it used to be the service system. One homeless individual would go to this agency for this, that agency for that, that agency for that. And the agencies didn't know that that same individual was asking for the same thing from all 3 or 4 or 5 different agencies. So it's really about unifying the service system to be aligned, to coordinate, communicate, and then to prioritize for those who most.
And just to give the big picture on that briefly, when I was in Washington, we encouraged communities around our country, some the size of Bellingham, some larger, to do cost studies and then to do the intervention of housing and then to do a cost benefit analysis. In the cost studies, it was determined that the cost of a chronic homeless person, again, randomly ricocheting from very expensive health and law enforcement systems, the range of those costs in communities was between $25,000 and $150,000 per person per year. So before housing, $25,000 to $150,000 in that random ricocheting. Again, Malcolm Gladwell's article, $1 Million Murray, spells all of that out quite well. Then when we did the cost benefit analysis, how much did those people cost when they were in housing? That range was, in the same cities, ranged between $12,000 and $25,000 per person per year. You don't have to be Susie Orman or Warren Buffett to figure out which of those is the better intervention. Obviously, placing people in housing and providing them with services is far less costly to the public purse than allowing them to be randomly ricocheting and demoralizing the very infrastructure of our communities.
You've mentioned several times the need for a comprehensive plan that works in both a government response, maybe a business community, nonprofit, et cetera. Can you give examples of communities that have a plan like this and that have shown measurable success in reducing chronic homelessness?
Happily, when I was in Washington, which is a number of years now, and I have to say that subsequent administrations moved away from a business and economic model on homelessness and kind of restored us to the pre-business strategy. But when I was in Washington, we monitored cities in terms of how well they were doing and who was getting results. And places like San Francisco, Denver, going over to Norfolk, Virginia, Miami, Florida, and a number of communities betwixt in between, including some cities in the Pacific Northwest. Portland, when Mayor Potter was there, who was a former police officer, he got it right away. He knew you can't arrest your way out of the issue. You can't sweep your way out of the issue. You can't shuffle people around. You need to be responding with housing. So Portland saw a substantial decrease in chronic homelessness during the time we were in Washington. We collected the data from 2005 to 2009. So there were a host of cities that saw substantial reductions. There was about a 55% reduction in San Francisco. There was such a significant reduction of homelessness on the streets of Denver. Then Mayor Hickenlooper, subsequently Governor Hickenlooper, now Senator Hickenlooper. There was such a substantial reduction. The cost savings were so substantial that he continued to invest monies that he took from the cost savings to create more permanent supportive housing, because he recognized that that was the vehicle by which cost savings were being achieved. So there were a great number of communities. In fact, every year we would have a gathering at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. We would invite cities from all over the country. And the very first thing that we would do in that meeting is ask what's happening out there. And I can tell you, city after city stood up after they had been implementing their 10-year plans for a while, and they reported on reductions in chronic homelessness in their communities. And other cities who weren't doing that, they would come up afterward and say, I guarantee you we'll be there next year or the year after. We'll be also reducing the numbers. But it was only by virtue of doing strategic planning, again, shaped around business principles and practices. That was what was added to the equation to get to those reductions. So yes, a wide variety of cities showed. Quincy, Massachusetts, a city of about 90,000, showed a substantial reduction. I can't remember them all, but there were quite a few and quite a range of demographics in those cities that saw reductions.
Okay, some quick questions just to get those out there.
Lightning round.
For folks, yeah, exactly. For folks that are living in hotels, how are their meals provided? Are they in small kitchenettes, or meals being delivered to them, or what works for that situation?
So when we convert a motel, part of the conversion is not only refresh on the room to convert from a motel unit into a studio apartment, but we also provide a kitchenette. So it's got a microwave and or a 2-burner stove. It's got a refrigerator, and we often will put a second thing in. So that's the whole point, is that they're transitioning to a life of independence. So we're going to teach them how to cook and how to buy and how to go to the grocery store. So we're not bringing the meals in. That defeats the whole purpose. It's about moving someone towards independence.
Got it. So once housed, are any of these individuals able to obtain an income stream? You know, their employability has probably suffered through their years out of regular work and on the street. Is that a goal? Is it a goal for some people? Is it even possible?
Well, obviously, there are some people for whom employment, in terms of many of the people that are served by Step Up, because Step Up orients itself in a community to the most disabled, the most vulnerable, the least likely to be able to sustain a job. So there are certainly a cohort of people who will never be employed, who will never actually secure employment. But the good news is that for the rest of, looked for employment initiatives for many, many years. It was actually the orphan of policy around homelessness. There weren't any employment efforts that really worked very well. There were a number of boutique efforts that small programs started. They they taught people how to be chefs and taught them how to make jewelry, but they were boutique. They were very small and only oriented the program. Only recently has there been an initiative called First Step. And the idea of First Step is to buy staffing agencies and repurpose the jobs in those staffing agencies into the lives of homeless people. That has the possibility, and we're already seeing it in Philadelphia, in Nashville, and in Atlanta. We brought it to Los Angeles and San Bernardino County. We see the possibility there of scaling employment in the same way that scaling is critical in the housing dimension. We need to be looking at efforts to scale employment for homeless people. That First Step program is the first step toward that objective, and it's looking to expand its parameters. So that's a possibility into the future.
Right. So I'm seeing a bunch of questions related to prioritizing serving the chronically homeless versus maybe the more newly homeless, the concern that the newly homeless, if you could just address their issues, you're preventing them from becoming chronically homeless. And is it whack-a-mole? You're just hitting each problem where you can. How do you balance those things? And how do things like investments in tiny home villages and support of tent encampments and all of that thing, is that money well spent, or should we really just be focusing on permanent supportive housing?
Maybe I'll take a crack at more than a crack at the chronic, and then Todd, you can talk about tiny homes and the like. Oh, I have some things to say on tiny homes as well. The Chronic Homelessness Initiative is based on research and data. It wasn't just someone in Washington thinking, what a good idea that would be for those poor people who are out on the streets. Actually, the data and the research indicated that there was this cohort of 10 to 15% of the homeless population who long-term homeless, disability, and who are the most expensive people in the community, and they were the people most likely to die on the streets. So the Chronic Homeless Initiative the whole strategy was shaped in terms of what the data and research said. That same data and research said that of the other population of homeless people, that in fact, that their homelessness would be resolved within a certain period of time on their own. They didn't require a deep government or private sector investment in their lives, which the chronic population required. So the chronic initiative followed what the data and research said to a population that could not resolve its own homelessness. So again, it's not a whim. It was based on the data and research. I do think that HUD has gone too far. It's a failure of federal policy to take all of the resources of HUD and orient them to the chronic population. That's a mistake. The chronic population for us, when I served in Washington, it was a priority population, but it wasn't the exclusive way in which we invested homeless resources. And certainly the idea of moving people out of homelessness as rapidly as possible, that makes sense. And there should be investments for that population. There should be further investments in employment initiatives for the people who are not chronically homeless. And then there should continue to be a priority, but there should be spending across the broad range of homelessness, not simply exclusively on people experiencing chronic homelessness.
So we're just almost out of time, but I would like to get to that tiny homes question because it keeps popping up here. So Todd, if you would please address.
Well, tiny homes there's quite a variation in what people call tiny homes. If you're talking about 75 to 100 square foot little buildings that don't have connection for plumbing and electrical and are under freeway overpasses or things like that, I don't support that at all. If you're talking about very small homes that are built in a community where people feel connected, remember, housing is about creating a sense of belonging. It's a little hard if you don't have running water or electricity and you're under a bridge to feel that sense of community and safety. So it's really about providing a home. It can be a small home, whatever that is, a studio apartment. It can even be a separate structure, but it has to be part of a community.
I think the dilemma on that, just very briefly, is that if the land on which tiny homes are going to be built, there's a certain number of tiny homes that can be built on that land. if far more units of housing can be provided for homeless people on that land by building up, then we have the ethical dilemma, because the critical aspect of ending people's homelessness is the provision of a unit of housing. And that's the thing that's least available in communities. So anytime we have an opportunity to build more housing for homeless people, we need to avail ourselves of that possibility. So if we can do 40 units where 12 tiny homes would sit, then we have to wrestle with the ethical implications of that.
Well, this is fascinating and very complex, but we want to be mindful of your time and the time that we've committed with everyone today. So I just want to thank you so much, Todd Lipka and Philip Mangano. This has been very interesting and informative. Big thank you, round of applause if you could hear us, if we weren't all muted here. Really appreciate this. I also in the comments that there's a lot of more questions associated, and we'll certainly bring this back to the programming committee to consider further programs in the future. I want to note that there are links in the chat to local plans that we, different organizations and governments are working on that they would like you to take a look and learn more about. There's certainly a lot of interest and work being done, and everyone is highly motivated to be solving this problem. And I want to encourage everybody to have a good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us today.